What if the biggest misunderstanding in this case isn't about who's right or wrong, but about assuming the court is reacting to the same story the public is following? Because while discussion around Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Ryan Reynolds has grown louder and more confident, the legal process itself has been moving in a much quieter, more restrictive direction. And once that difference becomes clear, much of what looks like momentum starts to look like misinterpretation. This video isn't here to decide guilt, take sides, or amplify speculation. It's here to explain how the case involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni is actually unfolding inside the legal system, and why that reality doesn't line up with the certainty surrounding it. The involvement of Ryan Reynolds, Wayfarer Studios, and the wider context of It Ends With Us adds visibility, but visibility doesn't change procedure. What's happening right now isn't a conclusion forming, it's a record being constructed. Courts don't respond to headlines or public confidence. They move through structured phases: discovery, scope disputes, testimony limits, each one quietly narrowing what can be argued later. Many of the moments being discussed publicly are being treated as judgment in motion, when legally they're groundwork. That disconnect is where confusion sets in. Activity gets mistaken for acceleration, filings get mistaken for decisions, and expectations form long before the court is positioned to answer them. Understanding that distinction doesn't resolve the case, but it reframes how to follow it. Because once the process is clear, the story surrounding this dispute starts to look very different from the one most people think they're watching. Before any conclusion makes sense, there's one question that has to be answered clearly: what stage this case is actually in. Despite how decisive the public conversation may sound, the case involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni is still in the discovery phase. That detail matters more than most people realize, because discovery is not about deciding outcomes, it's about defining boundaries. It's the part of the process where both sides are required to exchange information, clarify claims, and establish what evidence can and cannot be used later. Discovery is intentionally slow. Courts design it that way to reduce surprises and force precision. That means filings increase, disputes surface, and timelines stretch. From the outside, that activity can look like escalation. Procedurally, it's structure being built. Judges overseeing discovery are not evaluating credibility or intent. Their role is narrower. They manage compliance, resolve disagreements over scope, and ensure both sides follow the same rules. When objections are raised or motions appear on the docket, they are not signals of judgment, they are signals that the framework is being refined. This is where misunderstanding often begins. Public discussion tends to treat visible filings as turning points, but most of what shapes discovery happens out of view. Judges review full submissions, including sealed material and context that never becomes public. What audiences see is only a fragment of the record the court is working with. The presence of recognizable names, Ryan Reynolds, Wayfarer Studios, and the connection to It Ends With Us can amplify expectations. Familiarity creates the sense that developments should feel decisive, but courts don't move faster because of visibility. The same procedural standards apply regardless of who is involved. As discovery continues, the case doesn't expand outward, it narrows. Each exchange reduces uncertainty and quietly removes options from the table. Arguments become more constrained, not more dramatic. And that narrowing, subtle as it seems, is what determines how the rest of the case unfolds. Because when cooperation inside discovery starts to strain, the process doesn't stay purely technical, it shifts toward enforcement, and that's where the next layer of confusion begins. Once discovery is underway, the next place tension tends to surface is the docket itself. For many viewers, the docket looks like a scoreboard. Filings appear, responses follow, and each entry is read as progress for one side or the other. But procedurally, the docket is not a measure of advantage, it's a record of process. In this case, attention around docket activity involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni has grown precisely because filings are visible. Motions, objections, and requests can be accessed publicly, which creates the impression that each new entry represents a shift in the court's thinking. In reality, most docket disputes are about structure, not substance. Courts rely on the docket to manage flow. It tracks deadlines, compliance, and disagreements over scope.
When one side raises concerns about how filings are being used, the court's role is not to infer intent, but to determine whether procedural rules are being followed. That evaluation is technical, narrow, and often far less dramatic than the public reaction to it. This is where misunderstanding deepens. Public discussion often frames docket disputes as signs of misconduct or impending consequences. Inside the courtroom, they're usually treated as housekeeping issues, clarifying what belongs in the record, how information should be presented, and whether requests stay within allowable limits. Judges are particularly cautious here. They avoid drawing conclusions based on presentation alone. A filing that appears aggressive publicly may be routine procedurally. Conversely, something that looks minor can carry more weight depending on context the public never sees. Media coverage compounds this effect. Headlines summarize filings without reproducing the full arguments or the standards judges apply when reviewing them. As a result, the docket becomes a focal point for speculation rather than an administrative tool. What often gets lost is that docket disputes don't resolve cases. They shape how the case is organized. They determine what materials are considered, how arguments are framed, and what questions remain open. And as those questions become more tightly defined, the next phase of the process begins to shift attention away from paperwork and toward the people connected to it. Because once disputes over filings reach a certain point, the focus moves beyond documents and toward testimony, where the record starts to harden in ways that can't be undone. Discovery changes character the moment it moves beyond documents. Up to this point, most disputes revolve around written material, emails, schedules, filings, and formal requests. Those issues can be clarified, narrowed, or corrected through paperwork. But when discovery turns toward testimony, the process becomes far less flexible. Testimony hardens the record. Once statements are given under oath, they don't exist in isolation. They become reference points that every future argument must align with. That's why disputes over who testifies, what topics are covered, and what materials can be referenced tend to escalate at this stage. In this case, that shift brings additional figures into view, not because of public visibility, but because of proximity to events being examined. Individuals connected to production decisions, communications, or oversight become relevant as the court evaluates how information was created, shared, and handled. Names like Jamie Heath and Alex Sachs surface here for procedural reasons, not narrative ones. Courts approach this phase carefully. Judges set limits on testimony to prevent fishing expeditions, while ensuring relevant facts can be established. The goal is balance, clarifying what matters without expanding the dispute unnecessarily. From the outside, deposition disputes can look confrontational. Procedurally, they're calibrations. The court is deciding which facts will anchor the case and which claims remain outside formal consideration. Another important change happens here. Consistency becomes mandatory. Positions that were once framed broadly now have to align with sworn statements. Theories that don't fit the record begin to fall away. As testimony shapes the evidentiary landscape, the case grows more rigid, flexibility decreases, options narrow. And once the facts are locked in this way, the next stage isn't about what was said, it's about how those facts will be interpreted and who gets to shape that interpretation moving forward. Because once testimony defines the boundaries, the dispute turns to interpretation, and that's where the courtroom draws its sharpest lines.
As the factual record begins to take shape, another layer of the case becomes harder to separate from the legal process: industry structure. This is where public discussion often accelerates because the case doesn't exist in a vacuum. It sits inside the ecosystem of film production, studio relationships, and creative authority, particularly in projects tied to established intellectual property like It Ends With Us. Names such as Wayfarer Studios, Sony, and Colleen Hoover matter here, not as accusations, but as context. They define how decisions are typically made, who holds contractual authority, and where creative control usually resides. Courts pay close attention to those structures because legal responsibility doesn't arise from visibility or influence alone. It arises from documented roles and obligations. One of the most common misunderstandings at this stage is assuming that power dynamics automatically translate into legal conclusions. They don't. Courts distinguish carefully between industry leverage and legal duty. A party can hold significant influence in a production environment without violating any legal standard.
Conversely, conduct that appears minor publicly can carry legal weight depending on how responsibilities were defined contractually. This is why courts rely heavily on agreements, credits, and documented decision-making chains rather than reputation or perception. The legal system doesn't evaluate whether a structure feels fair. It evaluates whether it complies with the law. Public conversation often blurs this distinction. Discussions about who had control, who set the tone, or who benefited most can feel compelling, but courts require specificity. Who had authority over what, when, and under which agreements? As discovery clarifies those answers, many assumptions lose relevance. The case becomes less about generalized power and more about narrowly defined responsibilities. That narrowing can feel unsatisfying to outside observers because it strips away broader narratives in favor of technical detail. But that technical detail is what governs outcomes. Once the court understands how authority was structured and exercised, the next question isn't who seemed influential, it's how the record should be interpreted and who is permitted to guide that interpretation. Because once industry context is established, the focus shifts again, away from structure and toward who gets to explain what the record actually means. Once the court has a clearer picture of how authority and responsibility were structured, the next issue becomes interpretation. Facts alone don't resolve cases. Courts have to decide how those facts should be understood, especially when they involve complex industries, professional standards, or specialized environments. That's where expert interpretation enters the process, and why it's handled with particular caution. Experts are not brought in to argue outcomes. Their role is to explain context the court may not have first-hand experience with. That can include industry norms, workplace standards, or how certain decisions are typically made within a production environment. But because that explanation can shape how evidence is perceived, courts impose strict limits on who qualifies as an expert and what they're allowed to say. In this case, as discovery has progressed, the potential role of expert interpretation has become more visible. Courts examine qualifications, methodology, and relevance before allowing expert opinions to influence the record. An expert's perspective must be grounded in the evidence already produced, not speculation, not narrative framing, and not assumptions about intent. Public discussion often misreads this phase. When expert disputes arise, they're sometimes framed as signs that one side's case is strengthening or weakening. Procedurally, they represent refinement. The court is narrowing which interpretive tools are acceptable so that later arguments remain disciplined. Another important limitation is scope. Experts cannot introduce new facts. They can only interpret what's already in the record. That means discovery does most of the substantive work before expert input ever becomes relevant. If certain details never enter the record, expert analysis cannot fill those gaps. This is also where commentary diverges sharply from courtroom standards. Outside analysis often blends fact, opinion, and inference freely. Courts don't. They separate them deliberately, and expert testimony is one of the most tightly controlled areas of that separation. As expert boundaries are defined, the case grows more rigid. interpretive flexibility decreases. Arguments must now operate within a narrower analytical frame. And once interpretation is constrained this way, the next phase becomes unavoidable because attention shifts away from explanation and toward how the public understands a process that's becoming increasingly technical and less visible. Because as interpretation tightens inside the courtroom, the story outside it continues to expand, and that widening gap creates its own set of expectations. As the legal process becomes more structured and constrained, public attention often shifts in the opposite direction. It expands. This is where media coverage plays a defining role. Outlets report on what is accessible, timely, and understandable to a general audience. Filings that become public, scheduling changes, or visible disputes are amplified because they offer concrete moments to discuss. But those moments rarely represent the full scope of what the court is actually reviewing. In cases involving familiar names like Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Ryan Reynolds, that imbalance becomes more pronounced. Visibility creates demand for updates, and updates are often framed around what can be seen, rather than what is shaping the case behind the scenes. Silence, in turn, gets interpreted as absence, or worse, confirmation.
Courts don't fill that silence. They don't issue commentary to correct assumptions or explain procedural nuance. Their role is to decide issues placed before them, not to manage public understanding. As a result, long stretches of quiet activity are mistaken for stagnation, even as the record continues to narrow. This is especially true once discovery disputes begin resolving internally. Conferences, orders, and clarifications often occur without detailed public documentation. From the outside, nothing appears to be happening. Inside the process, boundaries are being finalized. Media narratives tend to struggle with this phase because it resists simplification. There are fewer dramatic filings, fewer clear winners or losers, and fewer moments that lend themselves to definitive framing. That doesn't stop speculation, it encourages it. As speculation grows, so does confidence. Audiences begin to believe they understand where the case is headed, even though the most consequential decisions are still being shaped quietly. This creates a widening gap between perception and procedure. By the time something concrete becomes visible again, expectations have already settled, and when those expectations aren't met, confusion follows. Understanding this silence gap is essential because it explains why legal outcomes often feel disconnected from the story people thought they were watching. Because once expectations solidify in the absence of information, the next visible development doesn't just update the story, it challenges the assumptions built during the silence. By the time a case reaches this stage, something subtle but decisive is already happening. The range of possible outcomes is shrinking. This doesn't happen through dramatic rulings or headline-grabbing moments. It happens through accumulation. Each resolved dispute, each clarified boundary, and each enforced limit quietly removes options that once seemed available. What remains is not the full story people imagined at the beginning. It's a much narrower version shaped by procedure. As discovery disputes settle and testimony parameters are fixed, the court's focus becomes increasingly selective. Arguments that cannot be supported within the established record begin to lose relevance. Claims that once appeared expansive are forced into specific legal lanes. This process doesn't favor one side automatically, it favors precision. From the outside, this phase can feel anticlimactic. There are fewer filings to react to, fewer visible clashes, and fewer updates that lend themselves to confident interpretation. But inside the legal process, this is often the most consequential stage. It determines what the court will even consider when substantive decisions are eventually made. For parties connected to Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and Wayfarer Studios, this narrowing creates strategic pressure. Once the scope of the case is defined, continuing forward becomes a matter of weighing risk against certainty. The cost of litigation is no longer theoretical, it becomes measurable. This is also the point where public narratives begin to lose alignment with the case itself.
Early assumptions, formed when information was limited and possibilities felt endless, don't adjust easily. But the legal process doesn't accommodate those assumptions. It moves forward based on what survives procedural scrutiny. Importantly, narrowing does not mean resolution is imminent. It means unpredictability is decreasing. The court is no longer sorting through everything that could matter, it's isolating what does. That shift often explains why later stages of a case feel quieter but more decisive. The groundwork has already been laid, the remaining path is simply less visible. And once that narrowing is complete, the next phase doesn't expand the story, it tests whether expectations formed earlier were ever aligned with the process shaping the outcome. Because when expectations stop adjusting but the legal framework keeps tightening, the next visible development doesn't just clarify the story, it forces a reckoning with how it's been understood all along. By this point, the legal process and public perception are no longer moving together, and that gap becomes harder to close. Early in a case, uncertainty keeps expectations flexible. New information can still change how events are interpreted. But once a narrative settles publicly, it tends to resist correction, even as the legal framework continues to evolve quietly. That's what's happening here. As discovery closes in on defined boundaries, many of the assumptions formed earlier remain frozen in place. Public discussion often continues to reference initial claims, early filings, or first impressions, even though the court is now operating under a much narrower set of facts and questions.
Courts don't intervene to realign that understanding. Judges don't issue explanations designed to update public narratives or correct misinterpretations. Their responsibility is to rule on matters before them, not to manage expectations outside the courtroom. This creates a lag. Procedurally, the case is moving forward, consolidating arguments, resolving disputes, and eliminating uncertainty. Publicly, however, the story feels stalled, unresolved, or even confusing. Silence gets interpreted as avoidance, and complexity gets mistaken for indecision. In high-profile disputes involving recognizable names like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, that lag becomes more pronounced. Familiarity encourages confidence. Confidence hardens into prediction, and prediction begins to feel like inevitability. But inevitability has no procedural weight. Courts don't accelerate to meet it, and they don't bend to align with it. They continue applying standards to a record that has already been shaped in ways the public rarely sees. This is often where frustration peaks. Viewers ask why nothing seems to be happening, why outcomes aren't arriving, or why the case doesn't reflect the certainty they've absorbed. The answer is usually the same. The most decisive work has already occurred quietly. Understanding that tension helps explain why later developments can feel jarring. They don't just move the case forward, they collide with expectations that stopped updating long ago. Because when the process finally produces a visible decision, the surprise isn't in the outcome itself, it's in how far the public narrative drifted before it arrived. When a decision finally appears on the docket, it often feels abrupt, almost disconnected from everything that came before it. From the outside, the timeline can look uneven. Weeks or months pass with little visible movement, and then a ruling, order, or resolution surfaces seemingly out of nowhere. For many viewers, that moment feels surprising, even confusing. But procedurally, outcomes rarely arrive without warning. They arrive after most of the work has already been done. By this stage, discovery has closed in on a defined record. Testimony has fixed the factual landscape. Expert interpretation has been limited. Scope disputes have been resolved. What remains is no longer uncertainty, it's application. Judges are no longer sorting through possibilities. They are applying established standards to a narrowed set of facts. The reason outcomes feel sudden is visibility. Courts do not narrate their internal process. They don't announce when arguments are eliminated, when issues are resolved informally, or when consensus begins to form around the remaining questions. That work happens quietly, through review, deliberation, and internal decision-making. Public discussion, meanwhile, tends to anchor itself to the most recent visible moment. When an outcome arrives, it gets linked back to the last headline, filing, or dispute people remember. In reality, the decision often traces back much further, to procedural rulings and evidentiary limits that shaped the case long before it arrived. This dynamic is especially pronounced in high-profile disputes involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and the broader context of It Ends With Us. Attention spikes around recognizable names and visible conflict, while the decisive work unfolds outside public view. As a result, outcomes can feel disconnected from expectation, not because the court changed course, but because the public narrative never tracked the process accurately in the first place. Understanding this helps explain why legal resolutions often feel anticlimactic. They don't answer every question raised publicly. They resolve only what survived procedural scrutiny. And once that distinction is clear, the final stage of the case stops feeling like a twist and starts to look like the inevitable result of a process that had been narrowing all along. Because when the process reaches its conclusion, what it reveals isn't just an outcome. It reveals how much of the story people were never actually watching. By the time a case reaches its final stage, it often stops being about the individual disputes that first drew attention to it. What remains is a clearer picture of how the legal system interacts with public narratives, and where those two inevitably diverge. This case, involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Ryan Reynolds, Wayfarer Studios, and the broader context of It Ends With Us, illustrates that tension in a way that feels amplified precisely because of the names attached to it. Familiarity creates expectation, visibility creates urgency, but neither translates into legal leverage on its own. Inside the courtroom, the rules remain consistent. Courts evaluate claims based on the record that has been built, not on how widely those claims have been discussed, how confidently they've been framed, or how long they've circulated publicly.
What matters is alignment. Allegations aligned with evidence, evidence aligned with procedure, and procedure aligned with legal standards. As this case has moved forward, much of the public conversation has focused on what feels persuasive, troubling, or compelling at a narrative level. The court, meanwhile, has been focused on what can be supported, defined, and constrained within the record. That difference explains why the case can feel unsatisfying to follow from the outside. The legal system is not designed to resolve narratives. It's designed to resolve disputes within narrow boundaries. Another lesson emerges here as well. High-profile cases rarely end in the dramatic fashion people expect. They don't conclude with sweeping declarations or definitive moral judgments. They conclude with orders that address specific questions, resolve limited issues, and leave broader debates untouched. That doesn't mean those debates lack significance. It means they exist outside the court's role. Understanding this distinction reframes the entire process. The case doesn't stall because it lacks substance. It slows because substance is being filtered. Each procedural step removes noise, uncertainty, and excess until only what the court can rule on remains. Seen this way, the outcome, whatever it ultimately is, won't represent a sudden shift. It will represent the final expression of a process that has been shaping the result quietly all along. At its core, this story isn't about headlines or speculation. It's about how the legal system functions when public attention is intense and expectations are high. For Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and everyone connected to this dispute, the result will come from what the court determines based on the record that has been built, not from the narratives that formed around it. Understanding that difference doesn't answer every question, but it explains why the case feels slow, why certainty comes early publicly, and why resolution comes late procedurally. The legal system doesn't move to meet expectation, it moves to apply rules. And when those rules finally do their work, the story people thought they were watching often looks very different from the one that actually mattered. If there's one takeaway here, it's this.
Following a case like this means watching the process, not the noise, because the process is where outcomes are decided long before they ever appear on a headline.